also want to talk about another issue that has happened just recently in this country, and that has a little bit to do with my background growing up. I grew up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Kenosha, Wisconsin was a company town. We had one very large employer, American Motors Company. We made Pacers and Gremlins, of cars that maybe were unique for their time and maybe collectible now, but certainly stood out in history. But American Motors did something really amazing for the community I grew up in. We were able to grow up in a strong middle-class community. People had family-supporting wages. And the reason they had family-supporting wages is not only because of the American Motors Company and later Renault and Chrysler, but also because of the United Auto Workers Union, a union that worked very collaboratively with the companies that were there in Kenosha and made sure that not only did people get a good, fair wage to support their families, but also they worked hard. And they made sure that those companies were profitable and delivered a very good quality product for the American people. So that was my experience growing up. My neighbors, my family, my friends all wound up having someone in their family working with American Motors Company or a company that fed into that. And we had good wages, and people had a good chance to grow up in a middle-class environment. Unfortunately, all too often we see these attacks across the country on unions, making it harder and harder for people who work for a company to have a voice in their company. And what happened just 2 weeks ago was there was a union election at a Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They had an election that was conducted by the National Labor Relations Board, where workers were deciding whether or not they were going to have a voice, a collective voice in their workplace. They were deciding whether or not they were going to unionize and join the United Auto Workers. And there were two extraordinary things about this election. First, the company was neutral. The company had made the decision to stay out of the choice because, after all, this was a decision to be made by the workers. We've seen time and time again how employers can easily interfere with this choice by workers. After all, they write your paycheck, and decide whether or not you get that promotion. They can fire you. So an employer can wield an immense and powerful influence over the workers who are trying to make a decision whether or not they want to unionize. And they can yield that power lawfully, and sometimes they yield it unlawfully. But in this case, the employer of Volkswagen said, you know what, this is the workers' decision, let's leave it up to them. And that doesn't happen very often in this country. And for that reason, the employer chose to embrace the notion that its employees had the freedom to choose. And that happened in Chattanooga. But there's a second extraordinary thing that happened also with this election, and that's despite the fact that the employer was neutral, a free and fair election was still rendered impossible because of interference and threats from outside parties. And what we saw here was unprecedented, and the shameful actions by outside parties interfered in a private decision by some 1,300 workers on whether or not they would organize for a better life. I would like to yield, yes, absolutely, to Mr. Miller from California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to join you in your remarks in expressing outrage about the situation in Chattanooga. In this case, these outside parties included both well-funded interest groups and publicly elected figures dead set on stopping the workers from joining the union. It wasn't enough that these outside parties to just say publicly that they did not like unions. It wasn't enough for them to say publicly that to the auto workers, hey, you know what, it's best for you and your family, vote against the union. It wasn't enough for them to say, we don't want unions to get a toehold in the South. No, they were not going to let these workers decide for themselves. They were angry at Volkswagen was officially neutral in this election. They were angry that Volkswagen had a long track record of successfully working with labor unions through joint work councils that innovate and reduce company costs. They were angry that a majority of the workers actually signed cards saying they wanted the UAW to represent them. They were afraid that what would happen if the NLRB election process was actually on the level. In the end, free and fair union elections became their biggest fear. Imagine that. In the end, a free and fair election became their biggest fear. So they decided they couldn't let that happen. If Volkswagen wouldn't scuttle this election, then these outside officials would. They laid in wait, and on the eve of the election, they then launched their assault, a barrage of untrue, inflammatory statements, the kind that we see from union busters all of the time, the kind that are designed to coerce, to scare, to intimidate, to bully, and to bully, and to bully hard working auto plant workers into rejecting the union. One of these third parties, an elected official, went to the press on the first day of the voting, the first day that the workers had a chance to vote, and he said that he had been, quote, assured, unquote, if the workers vote against the union, Volkswagen would manufacture a new line of SUVs in Chattanooga. And lo and behold, what happened? This last-minute bombshell led to a press frenzy, banner headlines, a barrage of TV coverage, all reporting and repeating the threat that jobs in Chattanooga were now on the line with this vote. Never mind that the company denied it. Never mind that that elected official's claim wasn't true. As he said, he had been, quote, assured, unquote, the junior senator from Tennessee said. And I'd like to yield back to the gentleman from Wisconsin. Thank him.
Sure. I thank my friend from California. You know, what you said is worth repeating. Volkswagen put out a formal denial of the claim, making clear that there was absolutely no link between the vote and the placement of the SUV facility in Chattanooga. And yet this elected official went out and did it again. He moved to discredit the company, astonishingly suggesting that the company was using old talking points, suggesting that he had the company's new secret talking points. And what happened here wasn't someone just expressing their view. What happened here was someone communicating a promise of benefits if workers voted one way, backed up by some mystery assurance. What happened here was someone communicating a thinly veiled threat that jobs would be lost if the workers voted another way, again, backed up by some mysterious assurance. The National Labor Relations Board is our nation's premier worker rights law. The National Relations Act. Like many of our civil rights laws, many heroic Americans in the last couple of generations gave their lives to secure the right to freely associate, to take concerted action to improve their lot collectively, to bargain collectively for better wages, better job security, for health care, for fair wages, and for a safe workplace. These workers were always brave, and they did not give in to thugs and battles. This National Labor Relations Act outlaws bribes and threats in the midst of union elections, and it does so for a reason. Those acts are not speech. They're more than speech. They render a free and fair election impossible. And in the case of UAW and Volkswagen in Chattanooga, since voting was already underway when these acts were committed, there was no opportunity to cure them. The votes were cast, and after 3 days, the election was over. And after the election, there are now 3 non-unionized Volkswagen plants in the world. One in Russia, one in China, and one in Chattanooga. And I'd like to yield back to my friend from California.
I just want to say on the last point the gentleman made, the reason these worker councils, why Volkswagen was neutral, is that they have found these worker councils to help them lead this industry in innovation, to be one of the largest and successful automobile companies throughout the world, and in fact they've used these worker councils in plants all around the world because that's the mechanism by which they've continued to be a leader and continued to have the growth that they've had and to have the products that they've had. And somehow, as you point out, in Russia and in China and now in Chattanooga, that model is being rejected, not because Volkswagen rejected it, but because the election process was not allowed in China, was not allowed in Russia, and was rigged and jimmied and obstructed by outside forces during that election in the United States. I thank the gentleman for taking this time.
Sure. Well, and thank you. And while we definitely want to make sure we're talking about all the issues that are important in this country, and the minimum wage is one that we want to also talk about tonight, we wanted to take this time just to highlight what happened, this travesty 2 weeks ago, and we hope that this will be cured. Outside officials, regardless of their perspective, shouldn't be involved in the election, but we want to make sure we're highlighting what happened because that election was not fair. Thank you very much, gentlemen from California, for all your many years of service on this.